Hi, welcome back to another video from Java for Beginners course from Course Labs. In this video, we're going to talk about variables and scope. Depending upon where and how they are declared, variables are of three types: local variables, instance variables, and class variables. If a variable is declared within a method or a constructor or a block, we can call it a local variable because the scope of the variable is only within the method or block in which it is declared. Instance variables are typically declared within a class but outside a method. Any method that is defined within a class can actually access these variables because the scope is actually specific to the class rather than specific to a block or a method. And the last type is static variables or class variables. When you declare a variable using the keyword static, this variable becomes static variable. Let's discuss more about these types of variables using some programs. So let's go ahead and open up our Eclipse. Okay, I have a template program. This is the skeleton that we have been using right from the beginning of our course. Let's first create some variables. So I'm just going to declare a variable called OS, which stands for operating system. So the value that I'm giving to this variable is Android. Now this particular variable is actually declared within the class, so we can call it instance variable. Now let me create a method here to display something, and let me create another variable here, string color. Let's say black. Now this variable is actually specific to this particular method, so this variable will not be accessible to any other block or method within this particular program. So for example, if I write another method here, void another method called test, and if I want to print system.out.println, and if I say OS, it happily accepts it, but if I say color, look at that, there is an error actually being thrown out by Eclipse because this particular color is a variable that is actually specific to another method, and this is not actually accessible from this particular method. This is basically a local variable. But instance variables are actually accessible from anywhere in this class. For example, let's say OS, there is no error, you can actually print this out. Even this variable can be accessible from display method. Right. Now if you want to access this particular color, it is possible to access it only from this particular display method because this particular variable is specific to this method, and the scope of this variable is limited only to the display method. Let's run this program and see how it looks like. First, let me just remove this here. Okay, we are just printing this color within this display method, and we are printing this particular operating system from this test method. Let's rather call it OS. The method's name is OS. Let's create an object for this class mobile. The name of the object is Samsung once again. Alright, and let's call this method display. Let's also call this method OS. Typically you can create any number of objects. For example, if I want to create another object, let's say Apple new mobile, the same way I can create another object, and I can actually call these functions using these objects as well. So apple.os. Perfect. So now we are actually calling this particular display method from the Samsung object. We are calling this display method from Apple object as well. If you notice, we are creating, whenever you are creating a new object, we are assigning the memory to each instance that you are creating, which means the modifications that you make using this object will not be reflected on this object. So if you just run this particular program, each of these objects will be able to access these methods separately. So let's try to run them. Click OK. Perfect. So if you notice this, the first two are actually coming from Samsung object and the last two are actually coming from the Apple object. To understand this particular concept in a better way, let's remove this string value from here and let's make it some integer. Okay, so this time I'm just making it an integer. Let's say int a equals to 10. Perfect. Now within this particular method, let's make it a, but before printing this, let's make it a++. Perfect. Here a++ increments the value of a by 1, which means whenever you call this OS method, this value of a will be incremented by 1, which means it becomes 11 and it will be printed here. Right, so let's now try to execute it and let's also comment it out because we are not interested in this method right now. We are interested only in this OS. Right, let's create this and run it. Look at that. In both the cases we have got the output 11. If you notice, we first call this and this particular OS function has been called and the current value is a and it is incremented by 1, which became 11 and it is printed. Now after that the control will be here and we are now creating another object and we are now calling this OS method using the newly created object, which is Apple, and this particular OS is actually called once again, but still the value a is 10. Though you have incremented it using this particular Samsung object and the value became 11 here, this particular change is not being reflected on this particular newly created object because the memory is actually assigned for each object separately. So the changes that are being made by another object will not be reflected here. Now if you want to make these changes reflected, for example, you are calling this Samsung.os function and it is making it 11. Now in case if you want this particular Apple to access the newly modified value, which is 11, you can actually make this particular variable to static. If you make this variable as static, the memory is going to be created per class rather than per object. So now if you try to access this particular program, if you just run this, notice that you are actually seeing this value 11 when Samsung is calling this OS method, but when Apple is calling it, it is actually taking the newly assigned value, which is 11, and it is making it 12. So this is basically what is your static variable. So if you name a variable as static, this will become a static variable. I hope you now understood what is instance variable, what is static variable, and what is local variable. We'll just quickly let's give a quick recap. If you create an instance variable that is accessible to any of these methods, if you create a local variable within a block or a method, that variable is accessible only within that block. If you make a variable static, the changes will be reflected across all the objects, right? So that's about your static, instance, and local variables. Hope you have enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.